Hey everyone, welcome back to the Jacobin Show. I'm Jen Pan. I'm here with Paul Prescod, who you may have noticed has been MIA for the last 2 weeks. Paul, explain yourself.
I'm sorry, I have a job, stuff to do. But last week I was at some of my students' graduation, so that was nice. But it is good to be back.
And the graduation also means that your official job is over, so you now have no more excuses, at least for the summer.
Yes, I'm on summer break, so I might look well rested now. I hope I do, unlike times before. But yeah, so now full commitment to the Jacobin Show. I will never do anything else ever.
It's only YouTube propaganda from here on out.
That's right.
Speaking of which, we have a great show today. Matt Christman, who of course is co-host of Chapo Trap House and a friend of the show. He's been on the channel before. He will be joining us a little later to talk about why the media sucks. In a nutshell, we'll unpack that a little more when he comes on. And Paul, what else is on your mind this week?
Well, also will announce people should also stick around that Ernest Garrett, who is president of AFSCME District Council 33, Municipal Workers in Philadelphia, will be coming on for a short little Labor Paul segment to talk about their contract fight. So definitely stick around after Matt is done.
Yeah, it's like a very special Labor Paul episode.
It is, yeah. But you can still submit Labor Paul questions that I will answer next week. So, but yeah, an article caught my eye and I had to talk about it. It was almost tailor-made for the Jacobin Show, but
the article was written just to troll you.
It was. I think it was.
Just kidding.
Combined all elements: education, identity, Koch brothers. So this interesting article in the New Yorker that talks about this strange new alliance between Black parents who are advocating for homeschooling and the Koch-Backed Walton Foundation. And so there's been this sharp rise in homeschooling since the start of the pandemic, and it actually shows that, especially among Black families more so than white families. And I think this makes sense given, the limits of virtual learning, why parents might choose to be doing this at this time. And the article also goes into other reasons that beyond the pandemic, why Black parents might be turning to homeschooling, like bad experiences in public and charter schools, their children being frequently punished, bullying, etc. And so it profiles this parent, Bernita, who talks about the experience of homeschooling her child and how positive it's been. And I think it makes sense that homeschooling could be very good for parents and children. I mean, your child gets the full undivided attention. You can tailor the curriculum to one individual very specifically, which is impossible in an under-resourced public school that has like over 34 kids in the classroom. So Bernita, this parent, wanted to form her own homeschooling collective. And so the problem is where she got the money from. And so in the article, as it says, in August 2020, Bernita applied for and won a $25,000 grant from Kerry Rodriguez Group, the National Parents Union, to fund a homeschooling collective called Engage Detroit. The National Parents Union paid for the grant with money from Vela Education Fund, which is backed by the Walton Family Foundation and the Charles Koch Institute. These groups advocate, quote, school choice, rerouting money and families away from traditional public schools through such means as charter schools, which are publicly funded but privately managed, and vouchers, which allow public education dollars to be put towards private school tuition. And this is kind of interesting because in the 1980s, homeschooling was championed actually mostly by white evangelicals. But recently, groups like the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, they've diversified, they've hired Black and Latino consultants. And so now these wealthy opponents of public education, like the Koch brothers or brother now, have found, they found another opportunity to kind of cloak their agenda in this seemingly anti-racist way. And so, the point here is not to beat up on parents who are trying to make the best of their dilemma, but I think we need to point out how you have this insidious situation where the failures of school privatization are being used to justify even more privatization. Mm-hmm. And the article also goes into, it says, I asked Keisha, who was another Black parent who was profiled, if it bothered her to accept money from the conservative libertarian Koch family, who has spent vast sums of their fortune advocating for lower taxes, deep cuts to social services, and looser environmental regulations. She says, I guess the bigger question is, why don't we have enough resources so that we don't have to get money from them? It bothers me, yes, but why do they have so much money that they get to fund all of our shit, she asks. I shouldn't have to get resources from the Kochs. And in a sense, she is totally right. No one should have to get funding from the Kochs. But by doubling down on school choice, whether through charter schools or through homeschooling, we move farther and farther away from being able to get the funding we need to improve public education. And again, the enemy here is not parents who decide to homeschool their children, but I think we can all agree that the vast majority of kids are not going to be homeschooled. That's not a viable solution to the problems of our education system, but it's really an insidious example of, institutions like the Walton Foundation, and the Gates Foundation as well. They pour all this money into charter schools, into destroying public ed. They destroyed it, and then they provide money to the people who are victims of this to implement their solutions. And that's what's so interesting about this, is because the article actually does criticize charter schools as well. And, actually charter schools are known for being more strict on discipline. And a lot of times this affects Black and brown students more so than public schools. And so now it's like the ultimate privatized solution of just do it at home and
no school at all.
Right.
No,
and
I'm kidding.
Well, and I'm sure, they're packaging like their own, curriculum that can be sold, to and have these programs on their laptops. So it's a really insidious situation that I thought we should highlight it.
Yeah, I, 100% agree with what you're saying. And actually, I wanted to shout out an article by Megan Erickson, who I know was on the education episode that I sadly missed. One of her earliest articles for Jacobin is called The Case for Cinder Blocks. It's a very classic, early Jacobin article. And it basically makes the argument that you just made against homeschooling, even when it's, branded as anti-racist, or even when it's branded as progressive or radical or anarchist. She goes into some of the same problems that you just talked about.
Right.
And I also want to touch on the fact that this story appeared in the New Yorker, and how lots of stories like this are appearing in the media recently, right? Especially during the pandemic. And, you have kind of this year of racial reckoning. The public school system has obviously been thrown into chaos. Racism is on people's minds. We know from polling and statistics that lots of Black and brown families, were more hesitant than their white counterparts to send their children back to school, obviously during the pandemic, but then of course compounded with some of the issues that you just mentioned. And, I've said this to you before, actually, I have come across so many articles lately, I feel like, that are very much in this vein. So there was a recent one in the New York Times about the rise of Afrocentric charter schools, right? I think, back to something that you just said, I think in the 90s and the 2000s, the kind of race-targeted charter school was a very no excuses, sort of militaristic, pull up your pants. That was the kind of charter school that was trying to target Black families, right? And there seems to be a new update on that, which is the Afrocentric charter school. That's we're all Black here. We tell kids to love their skin and love their hair. And, we play Beyonce's Formation. This was actually in the New York Times article, by the way. So I'm not just dropping in I don't know, false information or whatever. And then, the article that you pointed out on Black homeschooling. And I've seen an article in The Nation recently about, it was written by a Black mother and a journalist who was I choose to send my child to predominantly Black schools because I want her to, feel proud of herself and not be subject to racism and, see teachers who look like her and so on and so forth. And like you were saying, none of this is to blame the parents who are obviously just making what they feel to be the best decision for their children. This is not a criticism of them in any way whatsoever. But I do think it's interesting that the media seems to be so enraptured by this type of story, right? Because on the one hand, as you've suggested, the charter school model and the homeschool model really dovetail with this kind of neoliberal assault on public education. So even when it kind of has this progressive gloss, it's still, unfortunately, sort of bolstering this ideology of the free market, of privatization, of turning away from this idea of public goods, right? And just to kind of drive that home further, I don't know if you know this economist, Rucker Johnson. He's over at Berkeley, and he basically has done decades of research on school integration. So he looked at, some of the big pushes to integrate schools in the late 70s and the early 80s. And I think we actually don't talk a lot about integration these days. We hear a lot about segregation, right? Because there's been extreme resegregation of schools. And so, the New York City school district, for example, is like extremely highly segregated. I'm sure Philadelphia's is too. And so I think that oftentimes a lot of what we hear is like integration failed, or like, you know, we still have segregation. And it's true that schools are still very segregated, but I think what's really interesting about Rucker Johnson's research is he really makes the point that school integration worked. It just was stopped too early and didn't go far enough, right? So what he did in his study is he basically followed like a couple different families in a study and looked at the kids from when they had attended desegregated schools through to their adult lives. And he basically found that on almost every measure, high school graduation, college graduation, income, you know, what else? Lack of contact with the criminal justice system. Black kids who had attended integrated schools did much better off later in life. I mean, I don't think that's like a huge surprise. And when he talks about integration, he's like, it's not just desegregation. So it's not just putting Black and white kids in proximity to each other, although, you know, that is good, but it's also because integration has to do with money, right? It has to do with redistribution of resources, or gathering them or pooling them in a different way. And it also has to do with preschool. So he's saying that these three things, desegregation, money, and preschool, basically make a huge difference in the lives of kids. And also that these effects are basically so strong that even the kids who went to desegregated schools did better in life when he followed up with them. And that should make sense too, because if the kids who went to desegregated schools, you know, obtained higher incomes, had higher levels of education, like we know from everything we know about social science that their kids are going to be doing better too. And I bring up that example because his solutions, money, preschool, and desegregation, I think are actually very boring, right? Like they're not very spicy.
And they're also the old, I mean, this is like the old civil rights movement solutions, you know? And actually in this article in the New Yorker, they also talk about, I mean, some of the Black parents being torn because they knew historically, you know, how important public ed was for integration, and also the fear that, you know, they know that the more that they take their kids out of the public school system, that's going to hurt existing kids in the public school system, you know?
Right. So there's like a lot of conflict about that.
Right. Yeah.
But I mean, so that goes to my next point, which is, you know, these solutions are very old school, which is a much nicer way of saying like a little bit boring, right? Because we've heard about them since at least the 60s. But they're also really difficult. So that's kind of a fatal combination for being like sensational in the media, right? Like it's not very interesting because we've heard them time and time again, but it's also really difficult to achieve because you cannot achieve any of those things without basically a mass movement, right? But I think, you know, part of the reason why this other type of story kind of catches fire in the media very quickly, and that's the type of story, you know, that we were just talking about, like Black homeschools, like these alternative schooling models. I've also seen a lot of stories about, you know, some of the kids who were the first to integrate public schools who are now saying like, well, this was actually deeply traumatic, which like, again, is not a surprise. And like, that's not on the kids. Like, obviously, if you are on the front lines of the integration effort, like that's going to be really difficult. But these are kind of the opposite of the Rucker Johnson study because they're not boring, right? Like they're highly emotionally evocative. They seem to present a solution that's more readily available than, unfortunately, the like arduous and very difficult work of movement building, mass movement building. You know, then there's the third factor, which is that they do, as I said before, kind of uncomfortably dovetail with the predominant neoliberal ideology. And again, that's not to call the people who participate in these alternative schooling systems neoliberal or whatever. Like that's obviously not the point. What I'm trying to look at here is why the media loves them.
Right. And, you know, a critical line, and I think a lot of people don't quite realize this about charter schools. I mean, they're publicly funded. So they literally are siphoning off money from the public school districts. And this helps to further stratify the districts, not just you know, financially, economically, but by race, you know. So it really is all part of that same story. And I mean, we have this ridiculous situation in Philly where the average age of our public school buildings are about 80 years old. I've talked about in the show, lead, mold, asbestos, leaky roofs, all that. And all these brand new, shiny charter school buildings are being built with public money. So literally
Right.
public school district money is funneled for its own destruction, essentially. And I think, and it is kind of confusing. A lot of people don't quite realize that. And so and that's why, public school teachers unions are so adamant about charter schools. Again, it's not about blaming those parents or those kids or even those teachers. I mean, there's charter school teachers that are unionizing, but overall, if you look at where the money is, who is backing them, you kind of will see what the agenda is.
I'm just wondering, from your perspective as obviously a union member and a public school teacher and an opponent of charter schools, have you found a good way of countering the narrative that charter schools are anti-racist, or like they're better for Black students because public schools have failed so miserably at integration?
Yeah, I mean, and I think most regular people who are not so ideologically committed to charter schools, I kind of like that parent who at the end of the article said, like, I know this sucks, like we shouldn't be having to get this money. Like most people I talk to, if I say like ultimately like we wouldn't need charters if we adequately funded existing schools. I mean, honestly, for most people, even if they do send their kid to a charter, it's from a very pragmatic basis of like, look, my neighborhood public school sucked. This seemed better.
Yeah.
It is a little better. So I think for most people, it resonates that we should just fund the existing schools. And, one thing, and this might dovetail to what you might be talking about next with, critical race theory, is that I think something to highlight, I'm going to be very on brand here, is highlighting the role that unions can play in this because, teachers unions can take the lead on like advocating for better curriculum because, a lot of times in certain districts, teachers actually don't have much of a choice to do curriculum that might be better or more creative. They can also take the lead on insisting on different disciplinary measures, and things like that. Or just in general, I mean, if we got what we wanted as teachers, which is better staffing, lower class sizes, you would see less behavioral issues and less, discriminatory disciplining. So I think all these ways are ways of countering. But I do think for most people, like, they understand that we can and should just fund our existing institutions, and then people wouldn't have to make these difficult decisions.
Right. Again, it's just such a hard choice because if you're a parent and it's like, this charter school seems like a better opportunity literally next year, whereas obviously rebuilding public schools could take longer than my kid is even going to be in school.
Exactly.
It's really difficult. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you said the magic words, critical race theory. So yeah, I just wanted to briefly touch on the ongoing critical race theory brouhaha scandal that's been plaguing the media for the last several weeks. Actually, if any of you were watching the Jacobin Show from the beginning, you might remember that for our very first episode, we had Vivek Chibber on, and he actually gave a really succinct and really wonderful definition and explanation of why critical race theory is not a Marxist plot, as Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson have so frequently screeched. So if you want to watch him kind of give that rundown, check in our archives. It's there and it's really good, and I highly recommend it. But what I want to focus on today is actually a little different from that. I want to look at the media response to the critical race theory debate, right? Because as you guys probably know, there has been a lot of ongoing discussion about critical race theory because, first of all, Donald Trump kind of famously set off the sparks when he declared that the federal government would no longer be able to sort of teach or, do these what he called critical race theory, pseudo-Marxist trainings in federal offices, right? Since then, a bunch of Republican state legislators have sort of followed suit and are now introducing a host of bills to ban critical race theory from being taught in public schools. So I do want to say off the bat that just based on what I've been reading, it kind of sounds like these bills won't go very far. The consensus among legal experts seems to be that it's just grandstanding. They really won't hold up in court, or they'll be struck down. I can't comment on that myself. I obviously like don't have a legal background to say whether that will happen or not happen. So that part is to be continued. But like I said, I want to look at some of the liberal media responses to the critical race theory debate. So first I want to look at a tweet from Timothy Snyder, who of course is a liberal historian who has published many books. He recently wrote, "Critical race theory is common sense with an awkward name." So I now want to go through quite a few other media responses to the ongoing critical race theory debate, because I think that they're really instructive, and you'll have to bear with me because there's kind of a lot, but I want to go through all of them to like sort of make a point. Okay, so I think the first one that we have is, let's see, The Atlantic. So Adam Harris writes, "For Republicans, the end goal of all these bills is clear: initiating another battle in the culture wars and holding on to some threadbare mythology of the nation that has been challenged in recent years." Okay, next we have The Nation. They write, "What's important to understand is that conservatives are always trying to do this. They're always trying to keep some aspect of American history, some reckoning with the way this country has treated Black and brown people or women or LGBT people or indigenous people out of schools." I think he goes on to say, "It's always important to them that white children are kept ignorant about the details of how white people came to enjoy such power and wealth in a land they ain't even from. Keeping white kids dumb is as American as apple pie." Let's go on to the next one. I think it's, what is it? This is Business Insider. They write, "The GOP campaigns against critical race theory, which distorts the concept, is linked to a broader effort to stifle or invalidate conversations on the pervasiveness of racism in the US in relation to its history." Let's move on to the next one. What do we have? This is from The New Yorker. "Banning critical race theory seeks to, quote, establish a protective halo around white students so that they do not have to hear that their success might have something to do with their race, or that the structures of racial power and privilege in the past also apply to the present." On to the next one. "Conservatives have appropriated critical race theory as a convenient catch-all to describe basically any serious attempt to teach the history of race and racism." That's in Vox. Do we have one more? Oh, yes, of course. Here's from MSNBC commentator Joanne Reed. So she's saying, "What the CRT hysterics are essentially saying, literally without knowing what critical race theory is that teachers must not ask whether we have arrived via slavery and its aftermath at an unequal society. And even if we have, it's only fair that we freeze it there." Okay, so why did I go through all of these examples of liberal media personnel kind of entering the critical race theory debate? The reason is this. I think that they're all really similar, right? So what all of them do is, first of all, they talk about how critical race theory is just this culture war ploy by the Republicans. And that's, of course, true. But I guess what I would say to the charge that Republicans are ginning up yet another culture war is the Pope Catholic, right? I mean, they're always doing this. We talk about this on the show all the time. So yes, the Republicans are trying to use critical race theory to gin up a culture war. However, I think what's interesting about the liberal response is that they all seem to take the bait, right? Like they enter the culture war like completely no holds barred. So if you look at the examples that I just ran through, and of course, other examples that you can find basically just like anywhere you look in the news, the liberal response to Republicans sort of takes, trying to call it out as a culture war. But then also they do this thing where they're like, well, Republicans don't actually know what critical race theory is. And again, this is true, but I think that in many cases it comes off again as like a culture war shot, because it's like very pedantic. Like, well, the Republicans didn't read Kimberly Crenshaw's 1981 text and the 7th footnote on the 26th page where she says X, Y, and Z. And I mean, again, true, but I don't think that is a convincing way to convince anybody who, is confused about what critical race theory is, right? And then the third thing, which I think was really apparent in all of the examples I showed, is that with critical race theory, or the response seems to be, like, to go back to Timothy Snyder's tweet, critical race theory is just common sense by a complicated name. Like, what liberals are saying is that the kind of catch-all ideology and catch-all texts that Republicans are calling critical race theory are just common sense. We Republicans don't want to talk about race. Republicans don't want to talk about racism. Republicans don't want to talk about slavery, right? And again, I think that there is an element of truth there. But the thing is, the types of language and the types of discourse that these liberals are defending, which are things like white fragility, like the concept of white privilege, the 1619 Project, these are not the only ways of understanding racism and the history of slavery in the US, right? And I just want to quickly shout out Matt Karp's recent article in Harper's. It's really good. You guys should definitely check it out. History as End. He provides a really good rundown of how exactly liberals use the 1619 Project to obscure a class project, to kind of advance their own liberal ideology, and that there's actually many ways of understanding history from the left. Lots of Marxist historians have had criticisms of the 1619 Project, right? So I guess I want to just wrap up by saying that, if Democrats and liberals were actually interested in taking the wind out of Republicans' sails when it comes to critical race theory, they would say this. They would be like, while the Republicans are becoming hysterical about a totally obscure thing that nobody understands or cares about, we want to fund public schools. We want to raise teacher pay. We want to tax billionaires who have made a killing during the pandemic. We want to fix our crumbling infrastructure, right? I mean, that would be the way, I think, to diffuse the so-called culture war that liberals say that they're concerned about too. But I think at the end of the day, the culture war serves Democrats, and the culture war serves the liberal media as well. So I don't know, maybe Paul, do you have thoughts on critical race theory?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky because kind of like you alluded to, when Republicans say that, do they mean the technical academic concept, or do they mean just talking about race in general? And of course, obviously teachers, especially if we're teaching history or social studies, you need to be addressing race in somehow, and obviously know whether it's critical race theory or not, Republican legislators should be controlling what teachers, teach in the classroom.
Right.
But, and I think there are in some ways, like, in Pennsylvania, some of our left-wing state legislators have been good about, at the same time that this is going on, they're pushing for a bill to use federal stimulus money to rebuild our broken public schools. And they've been able to frame this in a good way of like, look at these Republicans talking about critical race theory while we are trying to rebuild these schools. Right. Which, by the way, I mean, Pennsylvania, some of the worst schools are also in these poor white rural areas. Yeah. So I think that's a great reframing. But it starts to get a little tricky because you don't even know what they mean by critical race theory anymore. And it's like, as a teacher, of course, I want to oppose this because I don't want anyone controlling what I'm doing. But at the same time, this sort of, a lot of these media outlets, for example, MSNBC, like, while they're clear on this, they're not really clear about charter schools, for example. Like, I think they, and as we know, the Obama administration in the past have been totally fine with that, or at least, and again, there's some nuance to that discussion, but like, they don't really do much to point out how that's hurting public ed in different ways. Yeah, I mean, going off what you said, I think in the case of somebody like Joy Ann Reid, like, she probably doesn't want to do the things that I said that Democrats should be talking about instead of critical race theory, right? Like, I think that she doesn't support Medicare for all, as far as I know. And she, has been a staunch and vocal opponent of Bernie-style politics from the very beginning. So to answer my own rhetorical question of like, why aren't Democrats or liberals doing this? I think some of them, really enjoy being part of the culture war or like get something out of it, whether that's, financial or even just like internet clout or whatever. But also, like, some of them probably don't believe in the project that I said they should be promoting instead. So there's that. And I guess, so before we bring on Matt, I just want to make one last point about kind of this ongoing imbroglio over, teaching history in schools. And that is that I do also feel like a lot of the recent discourse around critical race theory from the liberals who are sort of defending it against the Republicans sometimes suggest that radical or alternative history has just like never been taught in schools before. And that like the 1619 Project was the first time that like
public school children could have ever heard about slavery, right? I'm like exaggerating a little bit, but that is very much the tone that I think comes across in a lot of, the fervent pushback against these Republican bills. Like, well, kids really need to know about slavery and like need to know about the truth about race and racism in America. And history, of course, thanks to American federalism, like history in every state, of course, in public schools is different, and there are good and bad things that are sort of being pushed out there. But just on an anecdotal level, like I've mentioned before on the show that I grew up in Boise, Idaho, during the Bush years, which is like the most deepest red of the red states out there. At least it was back then. And in my public school history class, we read Howard Zinn. That wasn't the only thing we read. We had a little bit of Zinn. We had the standard U.S. history textbook, and then we had a conservative text. And the point, obviously, in class was to be like, oh, well, like here are like different competing accounts of history or whatever. And I will say, to be perfectly honest, a lot of the parents didn't like Zinn. A lot of the kids themselves didn't like Zinn. Of course, like I said, this was in the kind of 9/11 like Bush War on Terror years. So like jingoism and patriotism was pretty high. And actually, a group of kids in my class, like at the end of the year, got their Zinn books and like burned them, so like, so this is not to say.
Is there a picture of you burning a Zinn book, Jen? Come on.
No, I have gone on record saying that I love Zinn.
And I mean, this is totally anecdotal. And again, I don't deny at all that I'm sure there are many places where like there are bad controls over curriculum and things are not taught that should be. But honestly, a constant reframe I hear from my students, and I teach African-American history as well as, some other classes. And a lot of times I'll do a general survey thing at the beginning of the year about their history classes, what they've liked in the past. And I constantly hear, especially from Black students, is I'm tired of hearing about slavery. And what they mean by that is like, I'm tired of hearing that that's the only thing, in Black history. Of course, I'm not saying, I'm sure they're not saying we shouldn't learn about slavery, but just to kind of say that, in certain settings, I think it is taught a lot. And I've actually been kind of pleasantly surprised, at least in Philly, a lot of social studies teachers use Zinn pretty regularly. And, final point, I'll just, again, emphasize that, teachers unions have a big role in the curriculum. Like my union offers professional development for teachers as an alternative to the really shitty ones the district does. And they're generally very good, especially the social studies ones. So just don't, forget the role of the teachers unions in that as well.
Yeah. I was going to say, I know you personally are always talking to your kids about A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. So like, we can't pretend that there's no radical history.
That's right. That's going to be what they say. Instead of they're tired of hearing about slavery, they're tired of hearing about A. Philip Randolph. Sorry.
All right. Well, I think on that note, let's bring out Matt Christman. Everybody knows Matt Christman as a co-host of Chapo Trap House. He's been on the Jacobin channel multiple times before. Matt, how's it going?
Good. How you doing?
Pretty all right. So today's topic, of course, as you know, why the media totally sucks. And I got thinking about this topic because I recently came across like big survey that Gallup and the Knight Foundation had done. I think it was last year, but they basically found that public trust in the media is lower than it's ever been, which I think will not be a surprise to anybody. Oh, actually, we're going to talk about this graph a little later. But basically, public trust in the media is lower than it's ever been. Of course, we know that it's been declining pretty precipitously, probably since the 60s, right? But I think also if you talked to 5 different people, you would get 5 different answers about why the media sucks so bad. I think the ones that you hear most often are, number 1, that there's extreme bias, right? Number 2, that elites control the media. I think some people say that it causes, division and polarization. And a lot of people complain that it's just infotainment, like it's not news anymore. It's just, fluff. And I think that all of those things are true to a certain degree. And I would argue that they're all related to the class composition of the media, which I think we should get into later. But your eyes widened just now. So I want to ask you, what's the worst thing about the media today?
I mean, obviously, at a structural level, the worst thing about the media is that it's a capitalist enterprise. And so its logics are completely dominated by capitalism. And that really is the wellspring of most of the really like serious dysfunctions. I mean, obviously, the media has always been a captured institution of capital in some way or another. But, previous generations, there was enough a system to allow for at least the illusion of people doing a job as like, you know, a craft that people were invested in. But now, you know, yeah, the taking of something that is kind of by definition a public good, you know, like the transmission of information, which, you know, should be as you know, removed from politics and economics as it can be. Capitalism has now removed those rails, and now it's purely being instrumentalized, which means it's purely being driven by the same logic of viewer retention that the rest of the media is dominated by, which means there can't be any other pursuit other than eyeballs. And that means every idea, every pretension of journalistic integrity is actually suborned to eyeballs. And that's the thing that no one involved in it can say, which means you now have a media that's composed entirely of careerists and hobbyists, people who either are fully devoted to their media career as their identity and are lashed to the mast of it, or are doing it essentially as a lark and are generally comfortable scions of American wealth.
Yeah, so I want to pause on that for a minute because I have this really amazing quote by the journalist Robert Caro. So this is in the New Yorker, and he was talking about his first investigative journalist job. Let me pull it up here. So he's talking about his editor here at Newsday, which was the Long Island newspaper he worked for in his first job. And he writes, "We were never actually sure if he," meaning the editor, "had actually graduated from or even attended college, but he had a deep prejudice against graduates of prestigious universities, and during his last years at Newsday had never hired one, let alone one from Princeton, as I was. I was hired as a joke on him while he was on vacation. He was so angry to find me there that during my first weeks on the job, he would refuse to acknowledge my presence in his city room." I love that quote because he's obviously working in the 60s, right? And so this is like a totally different time when, of course, you had a much more robust kind of local newspaper ecosystem that could actually have non-college graduates working there. And I think, to me, this idea that like a newsroom would be like, we don't want a Princeton grad is like kind of amazing because you would never see that now, right?
God.
Yeah.
I was going to say, what an incredible world that must be.
I know. That editor sounds cool, by the way. But I also want to show now another thing from the Gallup poll that I was referencing earlier, because this is where we are at the media today. Actually, this isn't from the Gallup poll. This is from an Intercept article that's using a study that some academics did on the class composition of the media. So this graph basically looks at, if you can see, House members, millionaires, federal judges, Fortune 500 CEOs, and shows what percentage of them went to elite schools, right? So in the House, it's around 20%, federal judges is 40%. But then if you look at New York Times editors and writers, which is a few bars down, 43, almost 44% went to elite schools. Forbes billionaires, very similar, around 44%. If you look at Wall Street Journal editors and writers, around almost 50% went to elite schools. And then the New Republic editors and writers, this is like from a few New Republics ago, but like nevertheless, 64% of editors and writers on the masthead went to elite schools. So again, this is just a completely different world from the Robert Caro being shunned for being a Princeton grad. And I guess I want to ask you, Matt, this goes back to what you were saying about the media being at heart a capitalist institution. But there's kind of this like old school vulgar Marxist idea that the media is an arm of the ruling class. What do you make of that? Do you agree?
Oh, I think it is. And the thing about those old blue collar journalists is that they served up propaganda just as heartily as modern journalists do. That was their job, and it's always their job. But the difference is that they were able to provide, because of their sort of heterogeneous class composition and dedication to like this abstract notion of, the news as a separate thing from like the emotive, personal, social entrepreneurship of celebrity, that imparted on what they said a consensus reality that everybody on the political spectrum could sort of work off of, and that allowed for you to get ahead if you were trying to make a Marxist argument somewhere, because it was in the context of a shared reality. the real consequence of having this fully elite institution captured media now is that they're compelled beyond their desire to do so to create a totally insular media ecosystem that revolves around social liberalism as an existential element. Because these people are, it's not that they went to college to learn to be a journalist. It's that they went to college to learn how to see themselves as journalists, how to incorporate journalists into their self-identity. And it was as a profession, as an expression of one's virtue, as a way to live in life, a well-remunerated, creative, fulfilling job that also made you feel like a good person. And that was being in the media, and only certain people are going to ring to that dinner bell, and they are increasingly people who are wedded to expressing in their work a social liberal agenda, because that's what makes them a good person. And things get worse and worse, they feel more and more compelled to do it. But that guarantees that we broke the consensus reality, which means that everything that you can muster to try to get attention is going to fall on either deaf or already converted ears. And what you're saying is only to be filed, not to be engaged with. We're at a point where people have fully fractured their reality so that when they encounter an idea, an argument, a fact, it is only judged by whether or not it is on their side or not. And then that's it. And it's either used as ammunition or it's rejected. There is no engagement with it. And that is the real tragedy of it. And of course, it's not anyone's discrete decision to do this. It is just the end result of the media being fully capitalized.
And so it seems like, ever since the 1960s and the new left, the left increasingly has focused on the media as a, terrain of activity, of struggle in general. What do you think has led to this shift of focus to the media among the left?
I think that that people, and then there's sometimes, as I think, a category error that comes when people then apply agency to that and say, oh, the left made this decision to go to culture. Water finds its own level. As political avenues closed, those political energy went where it could be accepted, and that was in the culture. Okay, you're not going to overthrow the government, but you could get a job with the African American Studies Department at City College. You can get a job writing for a TV show. You can get a job being an educator. And then with the other areas foreclosed, with no profitable effort to be done that'll do anything other than get you chased around by the FBI, why wouldn't you do that? And so then the center of gravity moved away from the fight, because the fight had been lost in a way that nobody really recognized at the time. By the end of the 70s, the political fight of the working class as an element of America's political and social reality foreclosed. Its ability to be a counter-hegemonic force was foreclosed. But we're still around. We still have to fucking live. And we live in a world then where the motor of class conflict has been detached from our social conceptions of things like class and are only reproduced by a culture that is generated in elite institutions.
I want to follow that up by asking you your thoughts on, I guess what I'll call the alternative media, which I know sounds super 90s, but I just can't figure out what else to call it. And I'm asking because all of us on screen basically work in it to some degree, right? Because I'm thinking here of YouTube shows, obviously, podcasts, obviously. I know there's been a lot of discussion and scandal over the rise of Substack and newsletters. And I want to pause and talk about the mainstream media's or the traditional media's reaction to these kinds of different or independent or alternative forms of media. Because in my opinion, or at least from what I've seen, it sort of takes two forms, right? So the first is extreme hostility. So, that's why there was this big scandal over the rise of Substack and people's newsletters or whatever, as far as I could tell. Your own show, Chapo, I think has more than once been kind of on the receiving end of some sort of media ire about how you are espousing some sort of reactionary ideas. Actually, my favorite criticism of Chapo is that it's somehow a scam, as though your subscribers are signing up for they're directly paying for the revolution or something, but instead they just got a joke.
I thought I was paying for
podcast.
I thought it was like an Ethiopian princess or something Matt was trying to say.
Yeah.
That's what
Yeah, and like
did too.
I just like got this audio file, like Felix is making jokes. I don't know. Yeah, so that's my favorite one. But anyway, the point being that like there seems to be on one hand this kind of intense hostility, which I think at least part of is sort of the traditional media expressing some kind of anxiety about losing a little bit of its gatekeeper status, right? So there's that. But then I think there's actually what's maybe a more interesting phenomenon, which is that the traditional media, as its viewership is steadily declining, now has to compete with things like YouTube channels. And don't worry, I'm not talking about this one, but I'm thinking of like Crystal Ball and Sagar and Jetty's new channel, which has hundreds of thousands of subscribers already, or like Kyle Kulinski, or like even like Michael Brooks's show when he was on, you know, or like the Young Turks or something. All of these alternative media networks have way bigger audiences than like Harper's Magazine or like, you know, the New Republic or The Nation. And yet the traditional media outlets either don't acknowledge, it's not that they don't acknowledge them, they don't know about them. I mean, when I worked at the New Republic, you know, nobody knew about Kyle Kulinski, had barely heard of the Young Turks, you know, did not have any idea of this kind of alternative media network. And like at the same time, like if you were just to compare views, like those other channels are doing way, way better. So I'm wondering what you make of that weird division or like the mainstream media response to the rise of alternative media. And then maybe a follow-up question to that is like, what can the role of alternative media be other than a thorn in the side of traditional media?
I think that's always going to be what it mostly is. It's a way to afflict the comfortable among the media class because you aren't accountable to anybody. I mean, that is the fundamental source of the ire towards alternative media, is that you can't get anybody fired, which is the signal piece of social discipline in market, right? And that's what these people live in. Like that they've now created a free market. Everyone within it thinks there's some sort of communist or socialist or FDR liberal, but in reality they are living in the actual cutthroat knife edge of capitalism within the media class. Like they actually are fighting tooth and nail at the end of this thing because the media pie is shrinking. And they're all fighting to the death, but they think they're doing it on behalf of, you know, the human race when they're really doing it for their own advancement, but they have confused the two. So, you know, that's the main thing that they don't like about the alternative media, is because they aren't subject to their disciplinary regime. And so they get to say things that they would like to say maybe, or they don't want to hear. And so they are just resentful. But at the same time, you know, it really does highlight that, yeah, as you say, there's much more viewership on a lot of these alternative things, but it doesn't really move the needle in the traditional space. And it certainly isn't anything being consumed by the most politically consequential people in this country. Older voters, for example, they are absolutely disengaged with this. And the most alienated subjects of capitalism in America, who might be the clay, the forming soil of like a new like radical political counter mobilization of this country, they're not paying attention to it either. It really is still, it's the same class of media consumer who really just wants to hear what they want to hear. And that is kind of the trap that we all get caught into, is that at a certain point you are acting as a therapist for people, in the sense that they're going to pay for what they want to hear. And so that ends up being the division within it. You're not being ordered around by an editor or by a board, advertisers, but you are at a certain level, some way, either conscious or unconscious, being controlled by what your audience share is. And that's going to be determined less by your ability to persuade people than of your attractiveness to them as a consumer object. And so that really does mean that our ability to extend beyond an echo chamber and sort of reinforce existing patterns is minimal. So the question becomes, what do we actually communicate? Like, do we communicate something to people that will make them, in the rest of their life, in things that matter, make wrong or ill-informed decisions, or will they act with some sort of clear vision of what's in front of them? And that might come down to something that we tell them. And I guess that's just what we all have to tell ourselves, is that at the end of the day, we are providing fodder. We're providing little slivers of experience or memory or argument that might catch somebody at the right moment and them in a different direction. That enough people doing that, combined with the rapidly changing conditions that we're living under, moving people around and making people start considering things that they never would have thought possible before, that combination of people will have an effect, will be able to start exerting actual coordinated social power on the scene and change the calculus of capitalism.
So as a follow-up, I mean, maybe you might just give the similar answer, but, so we can agree, what we're doing in the left media sphere is not really politics, is not the main political task. So what is our role, especially in a time, I think maybe we can also agree it's a period of defeat and retreat right now for the left, to put it mildly. I mean, so what is our role? What are
I
we
would
doing?
say broadly,
what should we do?
Obviously, you could just reduce it to tautology, just do a good job. Say good things persuasively, but
say the best words.
more helpfully, something you could actually carry with you whenever you're dealing with a question, whether you're dealing with a topic, whatever is coming up that people want to see addressed or that you want to talk about. Ask yourself, what are the important questions? Mm-hmm. What matters in this, and then talk about that, and try to. Before you assail a topic, ask yourself that question instead of leading with what people want to hear about it, or what's getting people talking, or what is the source of people's ire, because that usually is the distraction. That's usually the thing that is a question that can only exist online and that exists only to be asked eternally to prevent people from directly facing the conditions of their life. And so all you can do is say, look, I know we're here, we're entertaining ourselves, but we also live lives. And while we're living those lives, what matters? What's happening around us that matters? And I guess that's the closest thing to a raison d'etre we can have.
I want to back up a little bit and turn to Noam Chomsky's manufacturing consent, which I think you obliquely sort of referred to earlier in the talk. And the reason I want to bring this up following from kind of this discussion of alternative media is because first of all, I want to get your thoughts on whether this model still holds up. And for anybody who's unfamiliar, I'm going to run through Chomsky and Herman's propaganda model in a second. But I think that maybe one of the advantages that non-mainstream media has is we're not necessarily subject to all of these specific filters. So I want to bring up this chart here. This is a graphic from a Scottish illustrator named Sean Michael Wilson. Check him out. I think he does a lot of left illustrated books. And this is from his graphic novel, or graphicization, I guess, of manufacturing consent. And here he is looking at, oh, sorry, Kale, can you pull up the 5 filters? So Chomsky and Herman in manufacturing consent kind of outline 5 different filters that make up the propaganda model, which they say all information and news has to pass through before it can reach the viewer or the consumer, right? So the first one is concentrated ownership. We all know about this. I think when Chomsky and Herman wrote the book, they were shocked that 20 media conglomerates control basically all, mainstream broadcast outlets and mass media publications. Now that number is 6. So this has only gotten worse. The second filter is advertising as the primary source of the primary income source of the mass media. We all know this is a problem because, of course, advertisers can choose to pull their funding and pull their ads if they don't like a channel or an outlet's content, or if they disagree with something that outlet has said. But I think that they also exert a more soft power in that, if outlets and publications see that one type of content is more advertiser friendly or more profitable than another, they're going to be more incentivized to run that, right? Okay, the third filter, reliance on information provided by, quote, expert and official sources. That's obviously, professional communications departments, whether that's in the State Department, the federal government, or, corporations, any institution these days, be it, the White House or a business or a nonprofit, has a dedicated communications department to sort of provide the official narrative to the press. So this takes the form of like press conferences, press releases, photo ops. Basically, if you're the government or you're a corporation, you have an unlimited amount of resources that you can spend on crafting the narrative that you want to get in the media. And of course, if you are the media, if you're a news outlet, you actually have a pretty limited set of resources to do investigative journalism. So that means that the press stuff, the quote official narrative from the companies and the government is always going to dominate, right? So closely related to that is the fourth filter, the idea of flack as a means of disciplining the media. So this is like another component of the PR apparatus, whereby when the media, puts out an unflattering story or, says something that a company or a politician doesn't like, they have an infrastructure in place to respond. And to just give one example, when I worked at the New Republic, every time I wrote a critical article about Amazon or about, this or that politician, immediately I would get a badgering and or threatening email from their press department, from their communications department, or from their legal department, being like, well, you should really consider that, like, actually, Jeff Bezos has put X, Y, and Z safety mechanisms into Amazon warehouses. And the point here is like, not that my articles were like so dangerous or something. They weren't like investigative journalism. Honestly, to be honest, like nobody was reading my articles at the New Republic. It's just that all of these places have entire departments whose entire job is to respond to, is to monitor the Google alerts, basically, right? And respond to any kind of negative press that they come across. So that's the fourth filter. And then the last filter is an ideological one. And when Herman and Chomsky wrote the book, which was in 1988, this is obviously on the eve of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So they identified this ideological filter as anti-communism. And I believe in recent years, they have updated that to war on terror, or they've said things like, well, you can replace anti-communism with war on terror, or even just free market at this point, right? As sort of the like underlying ideological apparatus that shapes a lot of media narrative that we hear. And so I just want to quickly run through the propaganda model, because I think the interesting thing about manufacturing consent, and specifically about this model in particular, is these are all structural and economic forces. So Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman, we're not saying that there's like a giant 1984 TV that just like blaring the same message at people. I think that they're also not saying that Rupert Murdoch or like whoever runs the New York Times are these like evil puppet masters who are just like willfully disseminating lies in order to like turn a quick buck. Although obviously like those people exist. And I think that they're actually very generous about individual journalists as well, perhaps more so than we would be, right? Like they are very clear that lots of journalists who go into the field, actually, as you mentioned, Matt, like think that they are doing good, or like actually are well-intentioned or have noble intentions. But these are structural forces that shape the media and shape how we receive information. And I think for that reason, in my opinion, the model really holds up, because those economic forces have only intensified since the 80s, in my opinion. And I guess my question to you is, what do you find useful about this model? And then if we go to the last filter, which if you recall was the anti-communism filter, like what do you think is the new update, especially in the sort of post-Trump, post-COVID era?
I would say that it is that the model is most useful when talking about the way to explain the actual motives of journalists within it, like how to square the professed and lived belief in journalistic ethics and objectivity that journalists genuinely embody with the reality of their placement in this machinery. And it is that self-selecting mechanism that happens without people even being aware of it. I would say that the biggest and then the question of what has replaced anti-communism, I guess now it would be some sort of, if you're talking about like the media, that's an interesting question, because we're now at a point where the media has now like sort of fractured into this like dominant sort of democratic media, and then this smaller but equally influential among its base Republican media, and they have different enemies, and but the enemy is the hero of the other one. I guess we've turned inward. Right. After the failure of the Iraq War, we turned inward, and now the enemy is us, and it's just a question of which half. And so the enemy now for the mainstream is that like recrudescent reactionary half, the Trump half, and then for the Republican, the shard of that left, and that now it's largely turning into just the internet. Is just it's the other half.
Did we lose Matt?
More media censorship, I guess.
Right.
Coercive mechanisms that define the actions of the mainstream journalists. That means they're going to engage on the same superficial bullshit. They're going to talk about the same culture war distractions. They're going to frame everything on capital's terms because they're subject to the same incentives.
And so, I mean, I think a lot of people interpret the manufacturer consent thing kind of narrowly as just brainwashing. And I think we're saying it's a little bit more nuanced to that. But do you think the left and people in general overstate the power of the media? I mean, I think the best excuse we love on the left whenever a left candidate doesn't do well or something shows that a policy we like is unpopular, it's the media, people are brainwashed, blah, 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 blah. Do you think we overstate the power of the media, especially on, maybe regular working people, not like the hyperactivated Democratic Party base?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing that it needs to be updated about the manufacturing consent model is just reducing its relevance to the grand scheme of consent manufacture, just because we've gotten to a point where the media is noise for most people. It is no longer this like fundamental organizing reality. If anything, for a larger and larger portion, it forms the antithesis of their reality. And the majority of people, especially the people who are feeling the social dislocation most profoundly, are alienated from it. They're not paying attention to it. They have disengaged from it because they have lived lives that have shown them every day that politics doesn't matter and that caring about it has to be some sort of affectation. And the thing is, it is an affectation, but it used to be an affectation that was easier to feel like it was substantial because there was something that looked like a direct relationship between how you voted and your material conditions. That's gone. So why the hell would you vote unless it indulges something in your character, unless it's entertaining in some way? And you've got to have a certain a point of view. You have to have had a certain acculturation to find that engaging, and that fewer and fewer people it's true of, which means the media is just it's being tuned out, and all it provides is just the fabric for people to form their own reality out of, which is what people are doing with QAnon. And what I think as like people get repoliticized, as things get worse, who have been alienated, when they come back into engagement with the media, it's not going to be on the media's terms and their reality. It's going to be by defining themselves against it and then using the broken pottery of the media world that they've encountered in their lives, fashioning some sort of antithesis to it that's going to mostly be some conspiracy bullshit, because there is no experience of organizing along class to complement one's understanding of the world beyond the media that they consume.
So on that point, I have to bring up this amazing graph from the Gallup poll survey that I mentioned earlier. So this looks at the basically Americans' trust in the media, which I said overall is very low. But when you split it up by political party, in 2020, you see a really interesting and crazy thing, I think, where the blue line is Democrats, obviously. 73% of Democrats who were polled said that they trust the media. Only 10% of Republicans, which is the red line below there, said that they trust the media. And then the gray line in the middle, 36% is independents. And I think that's really wild. And actually, when I was looking at it, Matt, I thought about a distinction you've made, I think, a couple times of the difference between the party of don't be a pussy and the party of don't be an asshole. So I think that probably a lot of viewers are like familiar with that distinction, but maybe lay that out again and like tell us what you make of that media chart.
Well, when the class engine got taken out of politics in the 70s, it was replaced by a purely effective politics that is detached from meaningful conditions. That meant that people, wherever they found themselves in the social strata, were going to find themselves more and more compelled to assert their identity through their politics. And that means that if you are somebody who is part of the media, who had a certain experience of life and was acculturated to certain values, your commitment to the social liberal agenda, broadly spoken, is going to become more and more central to yourself and to the stuff that you put out, which means that since that's the only real terrain of battle, the thing that defines the Democrats and Republicans, the Republican half of the viewership is going to, over time, notice that and become more and more alienated from the center of what's supposed to be the mainstream agreed upon reality. They're going to define it as along partisan lines in a way that they didn't used to. And that only gets more extended over time. And that means that there is a pressure on the other side among liberals to grab more and more onto the Democrat or onto the media and to invest more and more idea of the media as like part of their side, basically, which means that all the effort put into making the media say the right things and to be inclusive is literally designed only to backfire and increase reaction to it, because you're not persuading anybody at this point. You're not offering a neutral arbitration of issues. You're only offering grist for a mill that is a sterile cultural conflict between the two parties that defines politics by either entrancing people or alienating them, but not by arranging them along class lines in any way.
All right. Well, Matt, it's been great having you on. This is the last question for you, I promise. We're going to let you go after this. But speaking of the media, do you have any alternative media sources, podcasts, whatever, to recommend people?
I mostly just scroll my Twitter feed. I gotta say, I don't like to. I mean, I obviously I got the Jacobin. You know, I click on you guys. Oh, look at that! Get some articles going. But
all right. Well, you heard it here first from Matt Christman. Right. Subscribe
all
to Jacobin.
All media bad except Jacobin.
Jacobin good.
Yes, of course. Everybody on my everybody all the buddies get together. Do some good media.
Good
all
words.
right. Thank you, Matt. That was great.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. See you, Matt.
All right. That was very fun. We are going to pivot now to our other guest. So, of course, as you guys know, this is usually the time when we would have Paul answer some labor questions. But today we have a very special guest. He is Ernest Garrett, the president of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, District Council 33, which represents public workers in Philly. As far as I understand it, the union has a big contract fight coming up, and you all held a big rally earlier this week. So I'm going to turn it over to you and Paul to kind of get into the specifics of that.
How's it going, Ernest?
Hey, how are you, Paul?
Good. So I want to start maybe for our listeners. Can you tell listeners, what kind of workers does your union represent? And also, what has the experience been like since COVID-19 for your workers?
Okay, so we represent a wide range of workers, all the way from water department employees to sanitation workers to custodial workers at the airport, coroner's office, a wide range of workers, all of the blue collar workers and for the city.
Mm-hmm. And what's it been like, since COVID-19 for these workers?
It's been rough. It's been real rough. We don't have the luxury to work from home.
Right.
We have, no one truly understood exactly the extent of how to protect yourself while working through a pandemic. So you can't social distance inside of a trash truck that's only 5 feet wide. Many of these guys recycled COVID over and over because there were no way to social distance. We have city workers. You know, a lot of people think that the water department is just individuals that turn water on and turn water off. We have guys that have to go 40 feet down into a sewer inside that's filled with human waste and aerosolized fecal matter, which COVID is carried through, and with very little protection but a facial mask. And it's one way in and it's one way out. And so these guys were very afraid because there was no studies done. There was no time to see if people were going to contract COVID through aerosolized fecal matter. At our coroner's office, you know, dead persons don't talk, so they don't come in saying whether or not they have the COVID virus or not. It's been very rough. Our healthcare workers, our airport workers, I mean, you name it. There's no other employer that has dealt with COVID-19 in a manner in which we have. I myself contracted COVID-19 and stayed in the hospital for 14 days. You know, 90% of my lungs were filled with ammonia. So it's been rough. It's been really rough.
And, you know, what you said, it kind of reminded me of something I wasn't planning to ask, but even before COVID, like take sanitation workers, I think they've always been ranked one of the most dangerous jobs you could have, even, I mean, more so than a police officer. I mean, besides COVID, could you talk about like a job like sanitation? What are the daily dangers that they face on the job?
The sanitation worker is one of the most undervalued jobs. A lot of people think that it's easy to walk 7 to 11 miles a day. You don't get a choice to decide whether you can pick up this trash or not. And what happens is these guys, they don't have the time to stop, examine the bag, and see whether or not they're going to grab it. So often, especially with the rise of opioid addiction in this city, they grabbing bags and flinging them bags and being pricked and poked by needles, you know, and then they have to go through baseline testing and wait to make sure that they haven't contracted another virus that will surely end your life. Then with the rise of the housing market in Philadelphia, they have one of the most, these contractors, there should be something filed in the city to stop contractors from using the empty buckets as waste dispensers. So when these trash guys go and they grab this trash and they put it into the hopper and they compact it, these buckets explode. They now have a name for them. They call them South Philly bombs. you know, and we have thousands of pictures where they explode and you have human feces all over the hopper. Well, when it explodes and they get aerosolized, you know what I mean? You're now again at risk. You know, so the sanitation worker, I would ask anyone, if you think that's an easy job, try it. Try walking in 90-degree heat behind some of the most vile smell you could think of, and continue to service the citizens of Philadelphia with a smile on your face. Very difficult.
Right. And just imagine, I mean, 2 weeks without sanitation workers, let alone a month, 2 months, you know, what would happen to the city? So you all have a contract expiring. So you I think starting negotiations or have been in negotiations. Can you kind of just talk about how are they going? What are some of the main demands that you are looking for out of this contract?
Well, our contract ends the end of this month. We haven't sat down with the city yet. My position is clear with the city. I will not accept anything other than equality, equitable treatment for these men and women. I believe that's the reason why they put me in this position. And they didn't put me in this position to spin the wheel on a merry-go-round and let it stop where it stopped and take that as this hit. I mean, these men and women have worked through a pandemic willingly. You know, when they could have took the short route, like so many people, and said, you know what, go ahead and lay me off. I'll go take that check over there. It's safer. I don't have to worry about the pandemic. I could be in the comforts of my home, and I can add to that trash that these men got to go pick up. But they came to work. and with the fears of taking this deadly disease onto their family, they continue to march on. So I've told the city we have to straighten out some, District Council 33. We have been treated, and I believe we have been treated worse than human over the last 20 years. So we're asking for equitable treatment, an increase in health and welfare. We should be treated as the city's most valuable asset,
right?
But we're not.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm waiting for them to get back to me. Time is ticking, and it's a new rider on this horse.
Right, that's right.
You understand that?
Well, they will soon. If they don't know now, they'll know soon. Go ahead.
I was just going to tell you, Paul, I have nothing to lose.
Right.
And I'm doing all this for them young guys like me that men and women decide, this is the line of work I want to be in. No one is forced to throw trash. It's a commitment that one makes to say, I'm a proud sanitation worker. It's a heritage behind being a sanitation worker, especially for Black people in this country.
Mm-hmm.
When they make a commitment, they also make a commitment to that I want to be able to raise my family. Right. I want to be able to send my sons to school. I'll do this today so my sons don't have to do this tomorrow. That they could go on to get higher education and be doctors and lawyers and things of that nature. So it's a commitment that these men and women make to do these jobs, for very little pay.
Right.
And I think the city should honor that and respect that and treat their most valued asset as something special and not something that you scraped off the bottom of your shoe.
Right. And, and we bring it up a lot on this show, but I think a lot of people don't quite realize jobs like this, so good, stable union jobs. I mean, not just for Black workers, but I think especially for Black workers, I mean, it's like a critical lifeline. Like how many families have been able to send someone to college because of a job like this, even if they didn't go to college? So people, I think, really need to realize that, if you talk about Black Lives Matter, I mean, one of the most important aspects of that are unions like your union. So, last Saturday, the union had a really great big rally. I think we have some pictures of it that we can show. Really great rally. And so almost exactly a year before this rally that we're showing on the screen, I think when I first actually met you, exactly a year ago, there was another rally around sanitation workers, hazard pay, and PPE. So what do you think changed in this last year to make this rally so much more bigger? Because the one from a year ago wasn't nearly as big as this. So what changed in the last year, do you think, to make the membership, more unified and, participate more, make this rally bigger?
Well, I always say I'm a in the face type of guy. And I went out there and I look people in the face and I say, listen, the days of union leaders just accepting high paychecks and fancy cars and wanting to wear a fancy suit, they are over. They over. I want for you what I want for myself. But we a team. We a team. I'll be your voice, but I need you to be the body. I need you to be there with me, And I know that if you give people a belief in the union, then they'll fight for you. Wars for years have been fought over beliefs. And now I tell them, if you believe in this union, I'm ready to go to war to fight for your beliefs, So that's why, the people come out. We had an estimated 1,500, but we hope to have an estimated, if necessary, 10,000. Mm-hmm. So I hope we don't have to have that rally. I hope that they understand I'm not an old rodeo rider. I hope they understand. But if they want to go to war, then it is what it is.
Well, you have my number. I'll be there if they make that choice. So what about for yourself? How long have you been in DC 33? And how do you think the treatment of city workers has changed over time? Do you think it's gotten worse, better, the same?
I've been with District Council 33 for 24 years. And it was one of the best things I ever did with my life. I got out the military didn't know which way I was going. Tried a couple odd jobs here and there, and the city came through, and it allowed me to grow up, raise 3 wonderful sons. All have went on to graduate college, and my last one. And you know what saddens me is the pay hasn't increased. It's you know, the average salary for a city worker is around $1,000 every 2 weeks. And in this city, you cannot work for District Council 33 as a man and buy a home. The average homes in West Philadelphia, $250,000. Kensington is now $250,000 and up. I mean, I don't know where they expect us to live if this market continues to increase in the rate that it has.
Right.
You know, we need fair wages. So, you know, I'm not angry at the city. I think that some elected officials have to make the hard decision and stop wasting money or giving tax breaks to people that, you know, whether they pay $100 or $1,000, it ain't going to affect their bottom line.
Right.
Give it to the people that need it. Give it to the people that make 35, 40,000, 50,000 that need help. You know, some of our people are homeless. We had to open up an EAP in this building because we have members that work every day and can't afford to rent in this city.
Wow.
That don't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
So for the last question, I mean, you kind of just touched on this, but, you know, public workers, whether it's city workers, you know, I'm a public school teacher. We're always told there's no money for raises, for benefits, for more staff or anything. So first of all, do you think that's true, that there's no money? And second of all, you know, what should cities like Philadelphia do in the future, you know, revenue wise, to make sure that they can pay their public workforce and for the, you know, the services that you all provide in a sustainable way?
I'm going to be honest with you, Paul. And I've said this a million times. I don't care where they get the money from. When the Philadelphia Eagles wanted to leave Philadelphia, they found a way to help them keep that money and build that stadium in South Philadelphia. Tasty Cake, one of those big employers, wanted to leave the city of Philadelphia. They found a way to help them and restructure their incentives and move them down South Philadelphia. Let me tell you something. They can find a way to do what they want to do. Mm-hmm. They'll find a way. If they want to do something that's going to move them up that political ladder, they'll find the money. Let me tell you something. These men and women find a way to get up every day and come to work. The school teachers, it's a disgrace that they have 3 librarians and the Philadelphia school district, the whole district, 3 librarians. You see what's going on in this city. You can't expect, if a child is going to school and they're not getting a proper education and they're not being reared right, the street's going to teach them. Mm-hmm. And if the streets become their father, you see we have kids that are committing murder at 14 and 15 years old. We have people that will go up to the prison to commit murder. Mm-hmm. They have to start educating in our youth first. Get them when they're young. Because once they get 16, 17, 18, they're not listening to them. They ain't listening to me. Their parents is probably at work trying to keep a roof over their head. So who else going to teach them?
Right. You know, I always say to people, I mean, because what you just point out is kind of the crisis we're facing. And I always point out, you know, take the average youth in Philadelphia. So they're not funding the schools right. You know, it's less and less likely they'll be able to go to college or afford college. They're also cutting the trade school programs in the school. So now they can't, you know, even get like a good union job, or now they're going to start cutting sanitation jobs. So like, you really are trapping people. And like, what do you expect to come when you just keep cutting and cutting and cutting every option? What do you expect is going to happen next? And I think that's just what you spoke to.
Absolutely. I think the city would be better served if they stop fighting the unions and align themselves with the unions and see that, our goal is to make sure everyone is treated equal. We don't want to bankrupt the city. We just want to make sure that their workforce is staffed properly, that teachers are equipped with the tools that they need, that sanitation workers can work Monday through Friday and on the weekends take their kids to play baseball. So if you got time to spend with your kids, my mother used to always say, idle mind is a devil's workshop. She said, kid ain't got nothing on his mind. He gonna start doing some foolishness. And believe me, I know about doing dumb shit. I've done a lot of it. You know what I mean? But when you see better, you do better. There should be more teachers in school that we should bring back home economics and shop class and some more activities after school. You got after school activities. They're not out there playing in the streets. They're about people that love them and want to get things right. So I think if the city want to get it right, these organizations that are doing this to be a school teacher and what they pay, you got to love what you're doing.
Right.
Because it's not like you're uneducated. You could have took your education and went another route and said, you know what, I don't want to deal with kids. That's a passion in what you guys do. Just like it's a passion to be a sanitation worker. Just because you throw trash don't mean you should be treated like trash. It's a passion to say, I'm going to put on these coveralls and go 60 feet down in the sewer to unclog a sewer that's filled with everything, rats and everything, and it ain't nothing. You got to just sit there and let them rats run by your head. It takes a strong individual to do something like that. So I think if the city ever want to, change what's going on across this country, they need to stop fighting the unions and get in line with the unions.
Well said. And, I saw Richard Hooker, brother from Teamsters Local 623 in the comments, and I'm going to reference what he's always saying about, they called us all essential for a year. So now all these contracts are coming due. Now it's time to really show, if you think we're essential, you got to pay us like we're essential. You got to treat us like we're essential. So I really hope, part of your fight is helping people realize, if you didn't before appreciate sanitation workers or Amazon, delivery drivers, hopefully the COVID has made people wake up to say, these people really are essential. So thank you so much for coming on, and thank you for your fight. I'll be with you. Just hit me up when at next rally. And so thanks for coming on, President Garrett.
Absolutely. I appreciate you guys. And I'm going to make sure I'm a new fan of the Koch Show. You know what I mean?
Like and subscribe,
You heard it from Ernest Garrett.
And we love to have you back on, in the future. I mean, as things develop, we want to feature, union leaders and union members.
Absolutely. Well, you're a friend of mine. I like your style. You know what I mean? And it's nice meeting Miss Jen Pan. And we're here. Our doors are open for you. Anything we can do for you and your cause for justice and equality for working people, let us know.
Thank you, President Garrett.
All right, brother. Thanks.
Bye.
That was a great talk. I always love having a union man on, obviously. And I just want to point out something about the rally pictures, which were amazing. So shout out to whoever took those photos. If on some off chance you happen to be watching, they're amazing. But I noticed somebody was holding the classic "I am a man" sign.
Right.
And I love that. And I think that, probably lots of Jacobin viewers know this, but that sign came from the Memphis sanitation strike. And I think, that has kind of been lost in the general public. I think it's, I think everybody knows it's connected to the civil rights movement. But I think that sometimes people think it's just a kind of like generalized expression of dignity, which it is, of course, but it's also part of a sanitation strike. So just to go back to what President Garrett was saying about, the dignity of sanitation workers and what a tough job it is, and how it's often overlooked, and it's essential.
Right. And that strike, I mean, they were of course fighting over wages, benefits, but one of the things that triggered it was that 2 workers were killed in a trash truck, and that kind of really galvanized the struggle. But Ernest is great. I mean, with these union people, you see why they're elected. I would vote for Ernest. I would vote for Richard. So
same.
You can see why they're where they are.
Yeah, so Richard's here in the chat. Hey, Richard.
Yep, we're gonna have to bring him back on soon.
Yeah.
It's gonna be a fun summer.
He's supposed to be gearing up for his presidential campaign, of course, so he shouldn't be wasting time in the Jacobin chat. But good to see you.
He's probably asking for some donations in the chat. Getting his war chest built up.
Yeah.
But I heard, I don't know, Ernest Garrett might be his running mate. So
there you go. I mean, I'd vote that ticket for sure. All right. Well, that was a great show. Loved having Matt on. He's a great commentator as always. He of course also recommended that you all get a subscription to Jacobin. So take it from Matt Christman, Ernest Garrett. Good luck in the upcoming contract negotiations and any future rallies. We definitely will be following that. Paul, any last Labor Paul comments or?
Well, there's still time. Again, submit questions. I will try to answer more next time. And again, keep a lookout. There's a lot of contracts that are expiring in general. So any way you can go out to support a local union picket, do so. I think this summer is going to be full of a lot of labor action, I hope.
Likewise. And I also want to point out, actually, that next week's show, I think, is going to be great. We're having Cedric Johnson on. You guys probably all know and love him. If not, go check out his work in Jacobin and Non-Site and elsewhere. That's going to be a really good talk. So I guess on that note, thanks for watching, and we will see you next week.
All right. Good night, everyone. Go Sixers.